In the spring of 1943, a body washed ashore on the coast of Spain. The man was wearing a British Royal Marines uniform, and chained to his wrist was a briefcase containing top-secret documents. Spanish authorities immediately notified the Germans, who were desperate for any intelligence about Allied invasion plans. What happened next would become one of the most ingenious deceptions in military history, an operation so audacious that it would save tens of thousands of lives and change the course of World War II forever. This is the story of Operation Mincemeat, the dead man who fooled Hitler. By early 1943, the tide of World War II was beginning to turn. The Germans had been defeated at Stalingrad, and the Allies were gaining momentum in North Africa. Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and their military commanders knew that the next logical step was to invade Europe from the south, but there was a problem. The most obvious target was Sicily. It was the closest point to Allied forces in North Africa, and it would serve as a stepping stone to invade mainland Italy. But precisely because it was so obvious, the Germans knew it too. They had heavily fortified the island with troops, artillery, and aircraft. An invasion of Sicily would be incredibly costly in terms of lives lost. The Allied commanders faced a dilemma. They needed to invade Sicily, but they also needed the Germans to think they were going somewhere else. They needed a deception so convincing that Hitler himself would fall for it. This is where two British intelligence officers enter our story. Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley and Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague were members of a top-secret division known as the 20 Committee, or the double-cross system. Their job was to deceive the enemy through elaborate ruses and misinformation. These men were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were masters of deception, experts in the art of making the enemy believe lies. The idea they came up with was both brilliant and macabre. What if they could plant false documents on a dead body, make it look like the body had washed ashore after a plane crash, and ensure those documents fell into German hands? The documents would indicate that the Allies were planning to invade Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. If the Germans believed it, they would move troops away from Sicily to defend the other locations. It was an incredibly risky plan. If the Germans saw through the deception, it would confirm that Sicily was indeed the target, making the invasion even more difficult. But Cholmondeley and Montague believed it could work. They pitched the idea to their superiors, and after much debate, they received approval from the highest levels of British intelligence and from Winston Churchill himself. Now came the difficult part, actually executing the plan. The first challenge was finding a suitable body. They needed a corpse that looked like it had been in the water for several days, that appeared to be a military officer who had died in a plane crash, and that would not raise suspicion when examined. This was not an easy task. They could not just use any body from a morgue. After searching through records and consulting with pathologists, they found their man. Glyndor Michael was a 34-year-old homeless man who had died in London after ingesting rat poison. The circumstances of his death remain somewhat uncertain. It is unclear whether he deliberately took his own life or whether he simply ate bread crusts that had been smeared with rat poison paste to attract rodents, driven by desperation and hunger. What mattered to Cholmondeley and Montague was that his body was in relatively good condition. The poison had taken more than 2 days to kill him, which meant the cause of death would not be immediately obvious upon examination. Importantly, he had no close family who would ask questions about what happened to his body. With permission from the coroner, they took possession of the corpse. Now they had to create an identity for this dead man. They decided to make him Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. They gave him a complete backstory, complete with personal effects that would make him seem real. They placed letters in his pockets from a fictional fiancée named Pam, including a photograph of a woman who worked in British intelligence and had agreed to help with the deception. They added ticket stubs, receipts, a bill from a London club, even a stern letter from his bank about an overdraft. Every detail was carefully crafted to create the impression of a real person with a real life. The most important items, however, were the official documents. They created letters that appeared to be correspondence between high-ranking British officers. One letter was supposedly from Lieutenant General Archibald Nye, the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, addressed to General Harold Alexander, who commanded Allied forces in North Africa. The letter discussed Operation Husky, which was the real code name for the Sicily invasion, but presented it as a cover operation. The letter suggested that the real targets were Greece and Sardinia, and that Sicily was merely a diversion to fool the Germans. Another letter mentioned Sardinia specifically and discussed sending officers there to prepare for the invasion. The documents were masterfully written. They were not too obvious. They did not simply state, "We are invading Greece and Sardinia." Instead, they were written in the kind of casual, offhand manner that real military correspondents might use, with inside jokes and references that made them seem authentic. The genius of the plan was that the documents would make the Germans think they had stumbled upon genuine intelligence, something the British had not meant for them to see. With the body prepared and the documents ready, the next challenge was delivery. They needed to get Major William Martin to the coast of Spain in a way that would seem like a legitimate accident. Spain was officially neutral during World War II, but it was sympathetic to the Nazis, and British intelligence knew that anything interesting that washed up on Spanish shores would quickly find its way to German intelligence officers. They placed the body in a special canister packed with dry ice to preserve it during transport. On April 17, 1943, the body was transported to Scotland. On April 19th, it was loaded onto a British submarine, HMS Seraph. The submarine was commanded by Lieutenant Bill Jewell, who was told about the mission but not given all the details. He was simply instructed to release the body off the coast of Huelva, Spain, where the currents and tides would carry it ashore. In the early hours of April 30, 1943, HMS Seraph surfaced off the Spanish coast. The crew carefully removed the body from its container and placed it in the water. The briefcase was securely attached to the body with a chain, just as a real officer might carry important documents. Lieutenant Jewell read Psalm 39 over the body, partly out of respect and partly to maintain the solemnity of what they were doing, even though they knew this was an elaborate deception. Then they released the body into the dark waters and watched as the currents began to carry it toward shore. The submarine then traveled out to deeper waters where they attempted to sink the canister. After riddling it with machine gun fire and finding it still would not sink due to trapped air in the insulation, they finally destroyed it with plastic explosives. Within hours, the body was discovered by a Spanish fisherman around 9:30 in the morning. Local authorities were notified, and just as British intelligence had predicted, the discovery made its way up the chain to Spanish officials who had connections with German intelligence. The Spanish military examined the briefcase and found the documents inside. They photographed them carefully before returning them to the British, trying to make it look like they had not been tampered with. But British intelligence had anticipated this. They had placed the documents in the briefcase in a very specific way, with subtle markers that would reveal if anyone had opened it. When the briefcase was returned, they knew immediately that the documents had been read. The photographs of the documents were quickly sent to German intelligence in Madrid and from there to Berlin. German officers pored over the documents, analyzing every word, every detail. They checked the authenticity of the signatures, they verified the names and positions of the officers mentioned, they looked for any signs of forgery. The documents passed every test. To the Germans, this appeared to be a genuine intelligence windfall, actual British military correspondence that revealed Allied invasion plans. The documents made their way to the highest levels of German command. Adolf Hitler himself was briefed on the discovery. He was convinced that the documents were genuine. In a meeting on May 14, 1943, with Admiral Karl Donitz, Hitler declared that Sicily was not the next landing point, and that Greece and Sardinia must be reinforced. The Führer ordered massive troop movements. He sent the highly respected 1st Panzer Division from France to Greece. 7 infantry divisions were moved to Greece, and another 10 divisions were sent to the Balkans. Sardinia's troop strength was doubled. Naval units and torpedo boats were repositioned from Sicily to Greece. The Germans were preparing for an invasion that was never going to come. Back in London, Cholmondeley and Montagu waited anxiously for confirmation that their deception had worked. They monitored German radio traffic and intelligence reports through the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. Slowly, evidence began to accumulate that the Germans had taken the bait. They intercepted messages about troop movements to Greece. They saw reconnaissance activity increase over Sardinia. Most tellingly, they noticed that German defenses in Sicily were not being reinforced as heavily as they had expected. The deception was working. Winston Churchill received a message that simply read, "Mincemeat swallowed rod, line, and sinker by the right people, and from the best information, they look like acting on it." On July 9, 1943, Allied forces launched the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky. Thanks to Operation Mincemeat, the Germans were caught off guard. While they had some forces on the island, they had not concentrated their defenses the way they would have known Sicily was the real target. The invasion was still difficult and there was fierce fighting, but the casualties were far lower than military planners had feared. 160,000 Allied troops invaded Sicily. The island fell to the Allies on August 17th, just 38 days later, instead of the expected 90 days. Historians estimate that Operation Mincemeat saved the lives of thousands of Allied soldiers by reducing the opposition they faced. The success of the invasion of Sicily had enormous strategic consequences. It knocked Italy out of the war. Mussolini was overthrown on July 25th, just days after the invasion began, and Italy surrendered in September 1943. This opened up an entire new front against Germany and forced the Nazis to divert resources to defend Italy that they desperately needed on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. The invasion of Sicily also provided valuable experience for Allied forces before the even larger D-Day invasion of Normandy the following year. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Operation Mincemeat was that the Germans never realized they had been deceived. Even after the war ended, even after documents were captured and German officers were interrogated, many German commanders still believed that the documents found on Major William Martin had been genuine. They thought the Allies had simply changed their plans at the last minute. The deception was so complete, so thoroughly executed, that it fooled not just Hitler, but an entire intelligence apparatus that had been trained to be suspicious of exactly this kind of trick. The success of Operation Mincemeat was due to meticulous attention to detail. Every aspect of the operation was carefully planned. The choice of where to release the body was based on detailed studies of ocean currents and tides. Huelva was chosen specifically because it had strong currents that would push the body to shore, it had a German consulate with competent officers, the local Spanish military was pro-German, and British intelligence hoped the local coroner would not be as sophisticated as doctors in larger cities. The personal effects given to Major Martin were carefully selected to create a believable character. The documents themselves were masterpieces of deceptive writing, containing just enough truth mixed with lies to be convincing. Even the choice of Spain as the location was deliberate, because British intelligence knew that Spanish authorities would share information with the Germans while maintaining a facade of neutrality. The operation also succeeded because it played on German expectations and biases. The Germans expected the Allies to invade southern Europe, so documents confirming this were easier to believe. The Germans also had a somewhat arrogant view of British intelligence, believing that while the British were clever, they were not clever enough to pull off such an elaborate deception. This overconfidence made them less suspicious than they should have been. Additionally, Operation Mincemeat was part of a larger deception effort called Operation Barclay, which had already begun to suggest that the Balkans might be a target. The documents from Major Martin simply reinforced what the Germans were already beginning to suspect. Another factor in the success was the credibility that came from the body itself. If the British had simply leaked false information through a spy or a double agent, the Germans would have been more suspicious. But finding documents on a dead body seemed like genuine intelligence, something the British had not intended them to find. The apparent accident of the discovery made the information seem more reliable. To reinforce the deception, Montagu even included Major Martin's name in the published list of British casualties in the Times newspaper on June 4, 1943, making his death seem official and real. The story of Operation Mincemeat remained a closely guarded secret for years after the war ended. The British government did not want to reveal their deception techniques, partly because they wanted to use similar methods again if necessary, and partly to protect the people who had been involved. It was not until 1953 that the story became public when Ewan Montagu published a book called The Man Who Never Was. The book became a bestseller and was later adapted into a film in 1956. Even today, Operation Mincemeat is studied in military academies and intelligence services around the world as a textbook example of successful strategic deception. It demonstrates the importance of attention to detail, the value of understanding your enemy's psychology, and the impact that clever planning can have on military outcomes. Military historian Michael Howard called it perhaps the most successful single deception operation of the entire war. It also raises interesting ethical questions about the use of deception in warfare and the treatment of human remains. The identity of the body used in the operation remained a mystery for many years. Montagu never revealed who the man really was, describing him only as a bit of a ne'er-do-well, and that the only worthwhile thing that he ever did, he did after his death. It was not until 1996 that an amateur historian named Roger Morgan definitively identified the body as Glyndor Michael through documents he found in the Public Record Office. Even then, details about his life remain scarce. He was a homeless man who died alone, and yet his body played a crucial role in one of the most important operations of World War II. In 1997, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission officially recognized Glyndor Michael's contribution to the war effort. An additional inscription was added to his grave in Huelva, Spain, where he had been buried as Major William Martin. The inscription reads, "Glyndor Michael, served as Major William Martin, Royal Marines." It is a recognition for a man who, even in death, served his country in an extraordinary way. A memorial plaque was also placed on the war memorial in his hometown of Aberbruggaud, Wales, with the Welsh inscription Yad Din Na Fu Eriwed, meaning the man who never was. The legacy of Operation Mincemeat extends beyond World War II. It influenced the development of modern intelligence and counterintelligence techniques. The operation showed that strategic deception could be just as important as military force in achieving victory. It demonstrated that wars could be won not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of the enemy. The principles of Operation Mincemeat, creating a convincing narrative, using credible channels to deliver false information, and exploiting the enemy's expectations, are still used in military and intelligence operations today. The operation also highlighted the importance of interagency cooperation and secrecy. Operation Mincemeat involved coordination between British intelligence, the Royal Navy, the submarine service, pathologists, and numerous other individuals and agencies. Despite the large number of people involved, the secret was kept. Nobody leaked information to the press or to the enemy. This level of operational security was crucial to the success of the mission and remains a model for how sensitive operations should be conducted. One of the most fascinating aspects of Operation Mincemeat is how close it came to failure at several points. When the body was first released into the water, there was no guarantee it would wash ashore in the right location. Ocean currents are unpredictable, and the body could have drifted out to sea or washed up somewhere else. When Spanish authorities found the body, they could have simply returned it to the British without examining the briefcase. When German intelligence analyzed the documents, they could have concluded they were forgeries. At any of these points, the operation could have collapsed. The fact that it succeeded despite these risks speaks to both careful planning and good fortune. Cholmondeley and Montague did everything they could to stack the odds in their favor, but they also needed luck. The body washed ashore where they hoped it would. The Spanish authorities did exactly what the British predicted they would do. The German intelligence analysts saw what they expected to see rather than looking for signs of deception. Sometimes in warfare, success depends on a combination of skill and luck, and Operation Mincemeat had both. The human story behind Operation Mincemeat is also compelling. Glyndwr Michael was born on January 4, 1909, in Aberbargod, Wales. His father, Thomas, was a coal miner who committed suicide when Glyndwr was just 15 years old. When his mother, Sarah, died in January 1940, Glyndwr was left completely alone. He was homeless, friendless, depressed, and with no money. He drifted to London, where he lived on the streets. In death, however, he became Major William Martin, a brave officer with a fiancée waiting for him, a man whose loss would be mourned. The fictional identity created for him was more dignified and more successful than his real life had been. There is something both sad and redemptive about this transformation. For Cholmondeley and Montague, the operation was the defining achievement of their careers. They went on to other intelligence work during and after the war, but nothing they did had quite the same impact as Operation Mincemeat. Montague in particular became famous for the operation after his book was published. He spent years after the war giving lectures and interviews about the operation, always careful to protect certain details that remained classified. Cholmondeley, in contrast, remained extremely secretive about his intelligence for the rest of his life, rarely discussing it even with family members. The woman whose photograph was used as Major Martin's fiancée, whose identity was kept secret for many years, later said she was proud to have played a small role in the operation. She understood the importance of what they were trying to achieve and was willing to have her image used in this way. It is another example of how many people contributed to the success of Operation Mincemeat, often in small ways that were nonetheless essential. Operation Mincemeat also influenced popular culture and continues to fascinate people decades after the war ended. The story has been told in books, films, documentaries, and even a recent major motion picture in 2021. It appeals to people because it combines elements of a thriller, a mystery, and a historical drama. It is a true story that seems almost too incredible to be true, yet it happened. The idea that a dead body with fake documents could change the course of a war captures the imagination in a way that conventional military history sometimes does not. The operation raises profound questions about the nature of truth and deception in warfare. Military deception has been practiced since ancient times, but Operation Mincemeat took it to a new level of sophistication.